Picture this. Two of the closest trading partners in the world, the United States and Canada, are locked in a tariff dispute that is already pressuring steel markets and supply chains across North America. There have been rising claims circulating online about Canadian steel exports suddenly stopping and U.S. construction grinding to a halt. That part is not supported by verified reporting. There is no confirmed nationwide shutdown of Canadian steel shipments into the United States, and no documented evidence of widespread construction stoppages tied to a sudden cutoff. What is verified is this. The United States reimposed broad steel and aluminum tariffs in early 2025, removing exemptions that had previously protected many Canadian exports under the USMCA trade agreement. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, including steel and aluminum products. Trade negotiations between the two governments have since stalled, with both sides signaling limited willingness to compromise in the near term. This matters because even without dramatic headlines, tariff policy quietly reshapes costs, supply chains, and long-term economic stability. Stay with me. The full context changes how this story should actually be understood. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. Let's walk through the verified timeline. Early 2025, January-March, the U.S. administration reinstated tariffs on a wide range of Canadian goods, including steel and aluminum. On February 10, 2025, President Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the United States, including Canadian products, effective March 12, 2025. These tariffs effectively removed many of the exemptions that had existed under USMCA. The proclamations revoked all country exemptions and quotas, terminated all general production exclusions granted by the Department of Commerce, and rescinded the department's authority to process any new or renew any product exclusion requests. According to trade policy reporting and government notices, the base tariff rate on steel imports returned to levels that materially raised costs for Canadian exporters. Canada responded with its own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, targeting politically sensitive and industrial sectors. Effective March 13, 2025, an additional $29.8 billion Canadian dollars worth of products originating in the United States became subject to a 25% tariff in Canada, including steel, aluminum, and additional goods. These retaliatory measures came in addition to Canada's 25% counter tariffs on $30 billion Canadian dollars of imports from the U.S. that came into effect on March 4, 2025. Canadian finance officials publicly confirmed the retaliation was designed to pressure negotiations. March 2025. Reuters reported that at least one major Canadian steel producer temporarily paused exports to the U.S. while governments prepared for trade discussions. Algoma Steel paused exports of steel from Canada to the United States until Thursday, when Canadian ministers were expected to meet their U.S. counterparts in Washington, according to CEO Michael Garcia. That pause was limited and tactical, not a national shutdown. The company saw opportunity in the disruption, with Garcia stating the tariffs on U.S. steel would give Algoma an opportunity to acquire new customers from Canada since U.S.-made steel would suddenly become more expensive for Canadian buyers. Mid-2025, April-August tariff enforcement tightened further. In a significant escalation, President Trump issued a proclamation on June 3, 2025, that increased the tariff rate for imports of steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%, effective June 4, 2025. This doubling of tariffs dramatically increased costs for cross-border shipments. BCG estimated that the doubling of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports would increase total tariff costs to $50 billion. The Commerce Department also significantly expanded enforcement scope. In August 2025, Commerce added 407 product categories to the list of derivative steel and aluminum products covered by Section 232 tariffs, covering wind turbines and their parts, mobile cranes, bulldozers, railcars, furniture, compressors and pumps, and hundreds of other products. Canada responded with its own protective measures, including tariff rate quotas on steel imports effective June 27, 2025. Canadian officials signaled that steel and aluminum tariffs would not be resolved quickly and would likely be addressed during future USMCA reviews rather than through immediate bilateral deals. Prime Minister Mark Carney indicated that Canada was unlikely to reach a near-term deal with the United States to reduce tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other sectors, signaling that negotiations would likely be rolled into next year's review of the USMCA. Late 2025, October-December political tensions escalated dramatically after Washington suspended broader trade talks following diplomatic disputes. President Trump announced he would end all trade negotiations with Canada because of a television ad sponsored by Ontario that used the words of former President Ronald Reagan to criticize U.S. tariffs. The October incident occurred after Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced his province would spend $75 million Canadian to run anti-tariff advertisements on mainstream channels in the U.S. Although Ontario eventually pulled the ads at Prime Minister Carney's request, Carney stated that based on his judgment and the broader CUSMA negotiations, Canada was unlikely to achieve sector-specific agreements. That stalled momentum for any tariff rollback. In response to sustained trade pressure, Canada implemented additional protective measures in late 2025. Effective December 26, 2025, Canada significantly reduced steel tariff rate quotas and imposed a 25% surtax on many steel derivative goods. The government also eliminated the temporary surtax remission on steel imported from the U.S. for use in manufacturing, packaging, and agriculture as of January 31, 2026, and created a new steel compliance team within the Canada Border Services Agency focused exclusively on enforcement activities. What we see in the verified record is sustained trade friction and rising costs, not a sudden collapse of cross-border shipments. The trajectory shows a progressive tightening of tariff enforcement, from 25% tariffs in March, to 50% in June, to expanded derivative coverage in August, to additional Canadian countermeasures in December. Both countries have entrenched their positions, with resolution now tied to the USMCA review scheduled for 2026 rather than any near-term bilateral agreement. Comment if you've seen steel prices or delivery timelines change where you live or work. The real issue isn't tariffs alone. It's predictability and institutional trust. Trade agreements like USMCA exist to provide stable expectations for businesses investing billions in long-term infrastructure, manufacturing, and logistics. These frameworks were negotiated precisely to create the kind of certainty that allows companies to commit capital with confidence, building factories, hiring workers, and developing supply chains that span decades, not election cycles. When enforcement rules tighten suddenly or exemptions disappear without phased implementation, companies lose the ability to forecast costs reliably. Consider what happened in 2025. Tariffs jumped from 25% to 50% overnight in June, with the proclamation signed on June 3 and new rates taking effect at 12:01 a.m. on June 4. There was no transition period, no goods-in-transit exception, and no advance warning that would allow businesses to adjust procurement strategies. The Commerce Department subsequently added over 400 product categories to the derivative tariff list in August, expanding enforcement scope to cover everything from wind turbines to railcars to furniture. For companies that had structured their supply chains around the previous rules, each announcement represented not just higher costs but a fundamental shift in the operating environment. Legal analysts consistently note that while tariffs are lawful tools, abrupt regulatory shifts strain the spirit of negotiated trade frameworks. The USMCA was designed with specific dispute resolution mechanisms and review processes, including the joint review scheduled for 2026, precisely to prevent unilateral action from destabilizing cross-border commerce. When tariff policy changes through executive proclamation rather than through negotiated amendment, it raises questions about whether the agreement's foundational commitments remain durable. That increases the likelihood of disputes, arbitration, and retaliatory cycles that take years to unwind. The pattern of escalation followed by partial rollback, followed by new escalation, creates a particularly damaging form of uncertainty. Trade negotiations were terminated in October over an Ontario television advertisement. Then discussions about resumption began, but sectoral agreements remained elusive. Prime Minister Carney publicly stated that Canada was unlikely to reach near-term deals on steel, aluminum, or other sectors, with resolution pushed to the USMCA review process. For businesses trying to make investment decisions today, this ambiguity is itself a cost, one that doesn't appear in tariff schedules but shows up in delayed projects, hedged commitments, and risk premiums built into every contract. Canada's retaliatory tariffs are legally permitted under trade rules, but they amplify uncertainty and cost inflation across integrated supply chains. When Canada imposed 25% surtaxes on nearly $60 billion worth of U.S. goods, implemented tariff rate quotas on steel imports, and announced a new steel compliance enforcement team, it created mirror-image unpredictability for American exporters. The December 2025 measures, reducing quotas to 20% of 2024 levels for non-FTA partners and imposing global tariffs on steel derivatives, represented a further tightening that affects companies on both sides of the border. Integrated manufacturing, where components cross between Canada and the United States multiple times before final assembly, becomes progressively harder to sustain when each crossing introduces new compliance burdens and cost variables. This isn't ideological. It's structural. The question isn't whether any particular tariff rate is justified. It's whether the institutional framework that businesses rely on for long-term planning can survive repeated shocks. When rules change faster than capital can be redeployed, the result is reduced investment, shortened planning horizons, and a gradual erosion of the cross-border economic integration that took decades to build. If you believe consistent rules matter more than political swings, tap like. This dispute follows a familiar pattern. 2018 steel tariffs. When the U.S. imposed steel tariffs under national security authority, trading partners retaliated. Domestic steel producers saw modest gains, but downstream industries such as automotive manufacturing and construction absorbed higher costs. Multiple economic studies later showed downstream job losses exceeded upstream gains. The evidence accumulated over the years following those initial tariffs is striking. Research from economists at Harvard and UC Davis, drawing on Federal Reserve Board data, estimated that increased input costs from the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs resulted in approximately 75,000 fewer manufacturing jobs in firms where steel or aluminum served as production inputs. For every job potentially created in steel production, roughly 80 jobs existed in industries that consumed steel as a raw material. Household appliances, farm machinery, mining equipment, batteries, and hardware manufacturing all faced higher production costs that eroded their competitive position against foreign rivals. The cost per job saved was extraordinary. One widely cited estimate placed the figure at roughly $650,000 per job created in the steel industry, as downstream industries experienced an annual $3.4 billion loss in production from 2018 to 2021. A National Bureau of Economic Research study calculated that if the tariffs successfully created 35,400 manufacturing jobs, the number of steel and aluminum positions lost over the preceding decade, the deadweight welfare loss per job saved would be approximately $195,000, nearly 4 times the annual wage of a steel worker. Perhaps most counterintuitively, the tariffs did not even produce sustained benefits for the protected industry itself. Analysis from the Council on Foreign Relations found that output per hour in the U.S. steel industry fell by 32% since 2017, while economy-wide output per hour increased by 15% over the same period. Academic research consistently demonstrates that tariffs tend to depress labor productivity in protected industries through 3 mechanisms. They allow less efficient firms to survive, they remove competitive incentives for efficiency improvements, and they reduce collaboration and knowledge sharing with foreign partners. 2025 trade escalation. The current tariff cycle mirrors that dynamic. Protective trade policy aimed at one sector pushes inflation and volatility into every connected sector. The structural parallels are unmistakable. When tariffs doubled from 25% to 50% on steel and aluminum in June 2025, the immediate effect rippled through every industry that uses metal as an input. Production costs for electronics and machinery increased by as much as 50% in some categories. Automotive supply chains, construction firms, and general manufacturing all absorbed cost increases that originated in a policy designed to support domestic metal production. Survey data from the first quarter of 2025 captured the real-time strategic response. Over 50% of manufacturing CFOs reported actively planning to diversify their supply chains, nearly 40% accelerated purchases in anticipation of further tariff increases, and a significant share sought alternative foreign suppliers. About 32% of manufacturing firms anticipated reducing employment due to tariff-related cost pressures. These are not abstract forecasts. They represent concrete business decisions driven by policy uncertainty. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco's recent analysis found that following tariff implementation, the unemployment rate initially increases while inflation declines as demand weakens. Over time, however, unemployment returns to baseline levels while inflation increases and peaks approximately 3 years after the initial tariff shock. The pattern suggests that demand-side effects dominate in the short run, but supply-side constraints, higher input costs, disrupted supply chains, reduced investment, prevail in the long run. The defining issue in both cases is simple. Policy focused narrowly on production ignores the broader ecosystem that actually consumes the product. Steel doesn't exist in isolation. It becomes bridges, appliances, vehicles, machinery, and infrastructure. When the cost of that input rises, every downstream firm faces a choice. Absorb the cost and accept thinner margins, pass it to customers and risk losing market share to foreign competitors, or relocate production to jurisdictions with cheaper inputs. The firms that can least afford to relocate, smaller manufacturers with limited capital, often simply contract or close. The 2018 experience demonstrated that tariff protection for upstream producers does not automatically translate to net economic benefit when the protected industry represents a small fraction of the jobs that depend on that industry's output. The 2025 escalation suggests policymakers either discount that evidence or prioritize other objectives: industrial policy goals, negotiating leverage, domestic political signaling, over aggregate economic efficiency. Neither interpretation is inherently wrong, but the trade-offs should be acknowledged rather than obscured. Let me know if you see this as a recurring pattern or a one-off policy mistake. Here's what is verifiably happening on the ground. Price pressure. Steel and aluminum tariffs raise import costs. Those increases flow into construction bids, manufacturing inputs, and infrastructure budgets. Markets have already reflected higher metals pricing volatility since tariff enforcement tightened. The numbers bear this out. When tariffs doubled from 25% to 50% in June 2025, the U.S. Midwest premium for steel rose roughly 20% year-to-date, while aluminum premiums climbed approximately 65% over the same period. These aren't abstract price indexes. They translate directly into higher costs for every contractor bidding on a bridge, every manufacturer quoting a machinery order, and every developer budgeting a commercial build. An estimated 60% of U.S. companies reported logistics cost increases of 10% to 15% attributable to tariff-related disruptions over the past year. The mechanics are straightforward but relentless. A construction firm that sources structural steel now pays materially more for the same tonnage. That cost either compresses the firm's margin, gets passed to the project owner, or forces specification changes to reduce steel content. In competitive bidding environments, the firm that absorbs the cost risks losing money, the firm that passes it through risks losing the contract. Neither option is sustainable at scale. Business uncertainty. With trade negotiations stalled, companies hesitate to commit capital to projects with unpredictable material costs. Procurement strategies shift. Hedging becomes more expensive. Smaller contractors carry more risk exposure. This uncertainty manifests in measurable behavioral changes. Survey data from manufacturing CFOs in early 2025 showed that over half were actively diversifying supply chains, nearly 40% accelerated purchases to lock in pre-tariff pricing, and roughly a third anticipated reducing hiring specifically because of tariff-driven cost pressures. These aren't hypothetical responses. They represent capital that isn't being deployed, projects that aren't breaking ground, and jobs that aren't being created. The asymmetry of risk exposure deserves attention. Large corporations can hedge commodity prices, maintain legal and compliance teams to navigate tariff exclusion processes, and absorb short-term cost increases against deep balance sheets. Smaller contractors and regional manufacturers lack those buffers. When a mid-sized fabricator commits to a fixed-price contract and then watches input costs spike, that firm eats the difference or renegotiates, and renegotiation often means losing the client. The tariff regime effectively transfers risk down the supply chain to the firms least equipped to manage it. Political friction. Trade instability between close allies affects long-term investment confidence and regional economic planning. The October 2025 suspension of trade negotiations over an Ontario television advertisement illustrated how quickly political friction can derail commercial planning. Whether that specific dispute was substantive or symbolic matters less than what it revealed. Cross-border trade policy has become volatile enough that a provincial advertising campaign can trigger a presidential announcement terminating all negotiations. For businesses planning multi-year investments that depend on stable tariff treatment, that volatility is itself a cost, one that compounds over time as firms discount the reliability of any negotiated framework. Canada and the United States share the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, with nearly $3.6 billion Canadian in goods and services crossing the border daily. When the institutional mechanisms for managing that relationship become unpredictable, investment decisions get delayed, supply chains get restructured defensively rather than efficiently, and economic activity migrates to jurisdictions perceived as more stable. What has not been verified? There is no documented nationwide construction shutdown, no confirmed GDP shock tied to a steel export halt, and no evidence of mass shipment freezes across the U.S.-Canada border. This distinction matters. The tactical export pause by Algoma Steel in March 2025 lasted days and was explicitly linked to upcoming ministerial meetings, a negotiating tactic, not a market collapse. Cross-border trade continues. Projects are still being built. The economy has not seized up. But the absence of catastrophic disruption should not be confused with the absence of harm. Sustained cost increases, compressed margins, delayed investments, and heightened uncertainty all impose real economic damage. Damage that accumulates gradually rather than arriving as a single dramatic shock. The danger in focusing only on headline crises is that slower-moving structural harm goes unaddressed until it becomes irreversible. Separating real pressure from exaggerated claims matters. Overstating the immediate impact undermines credibility and distracts from the genuine policy trade-offs at stake. Understating it allows costs to compound without accountability. The accurate picture is one of sustained friction, rising input prices, stalled negotiations, defensive supply chain restructuring, rather than sudden collapse. That friction is real, measurable, and consequential, even if it lacks the drama of a border shutdown or a GDP crash. Stay with me because the long-term implications extend far beyond steel pricing. This story isn't about steel alone. It's about how modern economies function when trust, predictability, and legal frameworks weaken. Businesses don't invest confidently when rules shift suddenly. Supply chains don't remain stable when enforcement becomes volatile. And consumers ultimately absorb the cost through higher prices and delayed projects. Once uncertainty becomes embedded in a trade relationship, reversing it takes years, not months. Stability is not exciting. But it is the backbone of economic growth. If you value calm, fact-driven breakdowns that explain what headlines leave out, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll keep tracking where this dispute actually goes as new verified information comes in. And if this issue touches your work, your business, or your community, share what you're seeing in the comments.